We begin Western Civilization 1 with origins. Origins of civilization. When and where was the first civilization? What is a civilization? The first civilization began around 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, that is to say 3000 BC. This civilization was called Mesopotamia, which is a Greek word that means land between the rivers. Specifically, the first civilization, Mesopotamia, was located on a flat, fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This civilization, called Mesopotamia, does not exist today, but in that location we find the modern-day country of Iraq. So it is in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, where civilization began nearly 5,000 years ago. What is civilization? Civilization is often defined quite simply as an advanced stage of development, but that definition really does not go far enough in telling us what a civilization is. So here are the characteristics of a civilization. Mesopotamia, obviously, meets all of these characteristics. A civilization is characterized by a settled way of life. That is, people are no longer migratory or nomadic. They have a settled way of life, which includes living in towns and cities. They have also learned domestication of plants and animals, meaning that they do not have to follow herds. Instead, they know how to grow crops from seeds and how to breed and raise livestock. A civilization also has a medium of exchange or a system of money. A civilization also has social structures, or another way to state that is social stratification. Yet another way to state that is that a civilization makes distinctions among people based on status, wealth, land, power, influence. In other words, a civilization is characterized by social classes. Also, a civilization has a political organization, meaning a system of government. Civilizations also must have art, religion, and a method of keeping records, in other words, writing. All of these characteristics were present in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates River around 3000 BC. 5,000 years ago, civilization began not in the West, but in the Middle East. The first civilization, Mesopotamia, is sometimes dubbed or nicknamed by historians the cradle of civilization because it is the birthplace of civilization. It is also sometimes called the Fertile Crescent. Crescent because of its crescent-like shape. It's a semicircular area that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Fertile because it was capable of supporting large numbers of people in ancient times. We often have a tendency to think of the Middle East as dry, desert area, and while that is certainly true today and then, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is lush by comparison to surrounding areas. So it is in this area that civilization began. The geography, environment, and climate of Mesopotamia was very difficult. The Mesopotamian people had a tendency to be very pessimistic in their view of life because their geography, environment, and climate was harsh. Now, we've just said that Mesopotamia is called the Fertile Crescent and capable of supporting large numbers of people. That's not to say it was not without problems. In ancient Mesopotamia, flooding was often a problem. Devastating floods from the Tigris and Euphrates, which would wipe out homes of people, wipe away businesses. Also, there were problems with droughts and famine, erratic or no rainfall, unstable, unpredictable rivers, and occasionally 8 to 9 feet, salt tides would sweep in from the Persian Gulf and wither crops as they lay in the fields. So this horrible situation here in Mesopotamia in terms of geography, environment, and climate led the Mesopotamian people to be very negative and pessimistic, almost insecure and paranoid, wondering what the future held. This pessimism is reflected in their works of art, their literature, their religious beliefs, and certainly in their law code. This harsh environment created a harsh people. Mesopotamia also experienced problems with invasion because there were no natural barriers in that ancient civilization. In other words, no deep forests, swamps, mountains, nothing to keep out invaders. So the history of Mesopotamia is a history that is filled with problems such as invasion and environmental problems. This civilization of Mesopotamia began somewhere around circa 3000 BC. This civilization, Mesopotamia, started somewhere around the area of the Persian Gulf. The first settlements were made there by a group of people called the Sumerians. The city-state that they built there was called Sumer. From there, other establishments began in Mesopotamia, or other settlements were made. Originally, the Sumerians and the early inhabitants of Mesopotamia built simple towns with simple temples that were run by priests. This was somewhere around 3500 BC, but by 3000 BC there were walled city-states throughout the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. These included the city-states of Ur, Uruk, Akkad, Babylon, just to name a few. These city-states varied in size from as few as 1,000 inhabitants to several hundred thousand. For example, the city-state of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia had a whopping population of 400,000 people. The city-states of ancient Mesopotamia were just that, cities that acted as independent states. The city-states of Mesopotamia were not unified, they did not cooperate for their common good, and a person in ancient Mesopotamia would not have identified himself as Mesopotamian. He or she would have said that they were from Babylon, Akkad, Ur. In other words, a person's loyalty was to the city-state in which he or she was born. As I said a moment ago, there was no unified civilization of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was characterized by individual city-states, cities that acted as independent states, rivaling, competing with other city-states to be the biggest and the best. Walled city-states is how we describe these areas. What is a walled city-state? A city acting as an independent state surrounded by walls for protection. Since Mesopotamia lacked natural barriers, the city-states were identified in Mesopotamia, or I should say it was necessary in Mesopotamia for these city-states to surround themselves with artificial or man-made barriers for their protection. In other words, since nature did not provide barriers or boundaries to invasion, the Mesopotamians built these artificial construction of walls all around their city-states for their protection. Mesopotamia was characterized by independent city-states doing their own thing for quite a while. From about 3000 BC to about 2331 BC, that's nearly 700 years, the city-states of Mesopotamia were independent, doing their own thing. The man who changed the face of Mesopotamia was a guy named Sargon the Akkadian. Sargon was from the city-state of Akkad. He's called the first world conqueror, and that is somewhat of an exaggeration. Sargon conquered what was the known world to the Mesopotamians. In other words, he conquered Mesopotamia. Somewhere around 2331 BC, Sargon, from the city-state of Akkad, spread out throughout the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers with a small army, conquering and unifying all of the city-states of Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, this unification was short-lived. After Sargon and a couple of generations of his successors, the Mesopotamian city-states split apart and began doing their own thing, being independent of each other yet again. This remains the situation until 1792 BC. In 1792 BC, Mesopotamia has its second king. And what I mean by that is from 3000 BC, with the origins of civilization in Mesopotamia, each city-state had its own king. Two instances in Mesopotamian history where there was one king for the whole civilization was with Sargon the Akkadian, and secondly with Hammurabi the Babylonian. Hammurabi's reign is from circa or around about 1792 BC to 1750 BC. Hammurabi's claim to fame is that he established his hometown of Babylon as the administrative, political, cultural, and religious capital for all of Mesopotamia, and he was the king for all of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's most important contribution, however, to Mesopotamian history was his law code. This law code has influenced every law code since. You can definitely see its influence in the Ten Commandments and in Middle Eastern law to this very day. In fact, some of the wording in the Ten Commandments is very similar to the wording in Hammurabi's law code. Hammurabi told his people that he received a law code by which to govern them from a god named Shamash. By saying that his law code came from a god, of course, he was giving his law code much more prestige. While people in Mesopotamia may have been willing to challenge their king, they certainly were not willing to challenge their gods. If the gods had sent this law code, the people wanted to respect it. After all, if the gods were angry, they would often punish, so the Mesopotamians believed, would often punish Mesopotamia by sending droughts, flood, famine, or invasions, or war. So saying that his law code came from God made it much more likely that people would respect it. Hammurabi's law code operated on the principle of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a concept that we still associate to this very day in modern times with Middle Eastern law codes. Literally, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The punishment fits the crime. What you do to me, I do to you. If I am your victim, your punishment as the criminal is whatever you have done to me. If you removed my eye, I get to remove your eye. If you have broken my bone, I break your bone as your punishment. If you knock out my tooth, I knock out your tooth as your punishment. Punishment fits the crime. One of Hammurabi's laws in this code dealt with the veiling of women. In Hammurabi's code, he stated that when a woman, and by woman he specifies lady, meaning a wife or a mother or a daughter or a fiancée, was to be veiled from head to toe when she left her home. The only kind of woman who could be out on the streets unveiled, showing herself to the public, was a prostitute. Therefore, it was very easy to identify a lady and a prostitute. The prostitute would be bareheaded. So, even to this day, in many Middle Eastern countries, we find that women still veil themselves based on a tradition from Hammurabi's code that dates back to 1792 to 1750 BC. That means the idea that a Middle Eastern woman should be veiled from head to foot dates back nearly 4,000 years. Hammurabi's code was extensive, meaning that it covered every possible imaginable situation, and some situations that you would not imagine you needed a law for. Just to give you a few examples, Hammurabi's law code included consumer protection laws and minimum wage laws and animal cruelty laws. All of these ideas people associate with being modern inventions. Actually, the idea of minimum wage, consumer protection, and animal cruelty laws date back to the first comprehensive law code from ancient Mesopotamia. In other words, back to Hammurabi. What do we mean, consumer protection? Well, consumer protection is sort of like the modern-day concept of a lemon law. In ancient Mesopotamia, if you bought goods or services, it was expected by law that you got what you paid for and that it was of good quality. If it was not, you could demand compensation or replacement. I'll give you a couple of examples here of consumer protection in ancient Mesopotamia. If a family contracted a house, and I know that sounds strange, but it was true, in all of these Mesopotamian city-states, there were contractors, people who built houses for a living. Mesopotamians lived in mud brick houses. So a family may save up their earnings for a while, meet with a contractor, negotiate a contract, a floor plan. They build the house, they pay for the house, they're living in the house, shoddy construction, the roof caves in. According to Hammurabi's code, the contractor must pay to fix that roof at his expense because he did not do a good job with it. Supposing, and the law code says this, that in the process of the falling of the roof, all of your belongings are destroyed. The code provides that the contractor should replace all of your belongings with his own belongings or with new things. If the roof collapses, destroys all of your things, and kills your eldest son, remember, punishment fits the crime. What happens to the contractor? The contractor must pay to fix the damage at his own expense, replace all of your things, and yes, the law code says that the contractor's eldest son will be put to death as well. Students often ask, what happens if the contractor did not have a son? I cannot answer that question. No one can. We don't know the answer to that. All we know is what the code says. What we do not know is how strictly these laws were followed, if there was any leeway or room for interpretation. If that information was written by the Mesopotamians, we have not yet found it. Another example of consumer protection. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was common for a man, after work, to stop by his local mud brick tavern on the way home and get himself a beer or an ale. And you may never have considered this, but throughout history, what people largely have lived on has been milk, either from their mother in their first few years of life, a wet nurse, that is milk from another woman, or goat's milk, cow's milk, beer, ale, same thing basically, and wine. And of course you can throw water in there. Those are the only choices. So after work in Mesopotamia, a man would stop by his local mud brick tavern for a beer. According to the code, the man had a right to a good, strong beer. If he suspected that the tavern keeper, who was a woman in Mesopotamia, a woman could be a wife, a mother, a barkeeper, or she could also rent out rooms in her bar, and she may also choose to increase her income by offering certain services to her male patrons. So when a man stopped by his local mud brick tavern to get a beer from his barmaid, he expected the beer to be good and strong. If he suspected that the beer had been watered down, in other words, the barmaid was running low on beer, so to make it go farther she added water, he could accuse her of watering down his beer, and the law code provides that if he can prove this, and we don't know how he would prove it, but if he could prove it, the woman would be drowned in the Tigris or Euphrates for the crime of watering down her customer's beer. Also, minimum wage requirements in ancient Mesopotamia existed, as well as, laws preventing animal cruelty. We also find in this law code laws that deal with the protection of various male parts of the anatomy. Also, We find laws that protect a woman from miscarriage if she was involved in a fight and someone caused her to lose a baby that she was carrying. There are laws that deal with that, such as how much payment would be required for the miscarried fetus. They had laws for everything in ancient Mesopotamia, including adultery. According to the code, a man was allowed to commit adultery so long as he committed the act with a woman who was not property of another man, meaning she was not the wife or fiancée of another man. If she was not yet promised or not yet married, they could both get away with that. A man was allowed to commit adultery, a woman was not. If a husband caught his wife in the act of adultery, the law code tells us that he is allowed by law to bind the wife and the person that she is caught with ropes and throw them in the Tigris and Euphrates to drown. So this is a law code that is characterized by extensive thought. The Mesopotamians in their law code seem to have thought about every possible scenario for which you would need a law or guidance. How pervasive this law code is, we do not know. In other words, we don't know if they enforced this law code strictly, if they could interpret it, if there was any looseness about the code. We don't have that information. What I'm going to do next is talk with you about the accomplishments of the Mesopotamians. What have they contributed to civilization? Well, in terms of math, the Mesopotamians had a mathematical system that was based on the numbers 6, 10, and 60. They had mastered multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction, but also geometry and trigonometry. Now, what I am not telling you here is that they wrote textbooks on these subjects. They did not do that, but we know that they mastered these mathematical abilities because of the perfection that they achieved in their architecture. The Mesopotamians built multi-storied apartment buildings, large homes, elaborate temples and ziggurats, all perfectly square. You cannot master such feats of architecture without understanding applied geometry and trigonometry. The Mesopotamians also made contributions in astronomy. They charted the constellations, meaning they drew what they saw in the night sky. They developed a 12-month lunar calendar. They added a month in at intervals to harmonize the calendar with the actual seasons. They also developed a system of writing called cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped. Though they developed a system of writing, it is important to note that the Mesopotamians were not a literate society. While they had a system of reading and writing, not everyone had mastered it in the civilization of Mesopotamia. It was something really that only rich and well-to-do people learned how to do, reading and writing of cuneiform, because it was a very difficult, long process to learn how to write in cuneiform. So even though they had a system of writing and reading, not everyone understood it. What I will tell you about this practice of using cuneiform was that it was meant to preserve knowledge of things that Mesopotamians thought were important, such as lists of kings and rulers, business records, religious documents, law codes, obviously, contracts, various business arrangements. And when a Mesopotamian who did know how to read or write chose to write something of significance, what he would do, and I say he because it was primarily something that men knew how to do, they would collect clay from the banks of the Tigris or Euphrates River, shape it into a block like a brick or a tablet. They would take a reed or weed from the riverbank and use that as their pen, and they would write into this wet clay tablet a message in cuneiform, whether it was a religious text or a king's list or a marriage contract or whatever. They would then bake it in the sun, and it would be practically indestructible. That's why we know so much about the Mesopotamians. A separate subject here, religion. I want to talk about for a minute the religious beliefs of the Mesopotamians. The Mesopotamians, like most ancient people, practiced polytheism. That means they worshipped many gods. The Mesopotamians divided their gods and goddesses into earth and sky gods, gods of the earth, gods of the sky. They believed that their gods and goddesses had power over the earth and over the skies. When they envisioned their gods, they saw them as being anthropomorphic. That is a word that means human-like in appearance and also in personality. So just like there are nice people who were helpful, there were helpful Mesopotamian gods and goddesses. But there were also gods and goddesses like people who were mean, nasty, vindictive, and enjoyed hurting others. Many of the religious myths from Mesopotamia focus on gods who seem to enjoy victimizing the Mesopotamians by sending them drought or famine. So what I want to mention to you next is the creation myth of the Mesopotamians. It really shows you how they viewed life and what they saw as their purpose. This creation myth has a long title, and once you hear the title, you sort of know what the myth is going to be about. It's entitled, Let Man Carry the Labor Basket of the Gods. According to the Mesopotamians, in the beginning there was nothing but the gods. The gods created the earth and the sky, meaning they created Mesopotamia and the heavens. And originally, it was the gods who lived in Mesopotamia who did the work, who farmed. It was hot, hard, terrible labor, and it grew boring very quickly and very tiresome to the gods. It was agreed upon by the gods that they should create some kind of being or entity to do this work for them, and some gods suggested that the creation of human beings happened. So the Mesopotamian gods got together, used their collective forces and powers, and created human beings to, quote, let man carry the labor basket of the gods. The Mesopotamians believed they had been created in the image of their gods and goddesses to do the work that the gods and goddesses no longer wished to do. Mesopotamians believed that their role in life was to work hard, to please the gods, and to farm the land. Another religious document that I want to briefly discuss is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written by some anonymous author around 2000 BC, making it the oldest epic poem, period. Now, you may have thought the oldest epic poem was the Iliad or the Odyssey by Homer. Those were written around 800 BC. The oldest epic poem, period, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2000 BC. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a long poem, that's what an epic is about a hero. The hero of the Epic of Gilgamesh, well, that's Gilgamesh, who was a legendary, possibly he existed, we're not sure, a legendary king from Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh, according to the epic, was a wonderful king, really good at his job, but had a tendency to get involved in other people's business a little too much. The gods of Mesopotamia decided to send an enemy or rival to Gilgamesh to take up some of his time so he wouldn't be so nosy and so much of a busybody sticking his nose in other people's business. They sent to him a creature called Enkidu, and this creature was supposed to terrorize Mesopotamia and give Gilgamesh problems. Well, Gilgamesh was able to defeat Enkidu, and the two became the best of friends, traveling around, doing these legendary stunts and feats, and this attracted the attention of a particular goddess by the name of Ishtar, who asked Gilgamesh for his hand in marriage. He refused her, so she killed Enkidu. As we said before, Mesopotamians viewed their gods as very harsh and vindictive, and here's a perfect example. After watching his friend Enkidu die, Gilgamesh was horrified by the prospect of death and dying. He traveled around Mesopotamia looking for the secret to everlasting life, which he never found. Mesopotamians never quite worked out for themselves whether or not they believed in an afterlife. They believed that this was something that could be bestowed upon a person for good deeds or for bad deeds. A person could be punished for good deeds. He could be rewarded in everlasting life, but it was a rarity that happened, so believed the Mesopotamians. So Gilgamesh, after losing his friend, looks for the secret to immortality, for everlasting life, to the afterlife. He never finds that secret. He decides at that point his goal and his destiny is to be the best king he can be, and that's how he is known as a result of the Epic of Gilgamesh as one of the greatest kings who ever existed, if he actually existed, in Mesopotamia. His experiences looking for everlasting life inspired him to be the best king he could be. In order to please their gods, the Mesopotamians built in the geographic center of every city-state a pyramid called a ziggurat, which was about 150 feet high, a stepped pyramid or temple. It was offered as a bribe and a home to the gods. In every city-state, the people worshipped and believed in all of their 100 or so gods and goddesses, but they would pick 2 or 3 to whom they would dedicate the ziggurat, and it was the job of the priest to make sure that the ziggurat was always well maintained, clean, taken care of, so that the gods were pleased. They believed, again, if they didn't work hard enough or keep the ziggurat nice enough, that the gods of Mesopotamia would punish them by sending invasion, drought, or flood. In an effort to see into the future, the Mesopotamians practiced divination, or attempted to predict the future through various means such as dropping beads of oil in water, trying to see a message in the patterns, looking for patterns in smoke, and animal sacrifices. They did all of this to see what their gods had in store for them. The last topic I'm going to talk with you about in our look at Mesopotamia is their social structure. The social structure of Mesopotamia was patriarchal, meaning male-dominated. Older adult males from elite rich groups dominated society in Mesopotamia. That is reflected in Hammurabi's code. We see that men of high status in Mesopotamia, often, even in the law code, were allowed to victimize people who were of lower status than themselves and simply walk away from the crime by paying a fine rather than physical mutilation. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth did not apply in Mesopotamia except when a victim and a criminal were of the same social class. So standing at the top of this society was a king. In every city-state there was a king. Each city-state had its own king called a lugal. This was, of course, not the case during the time of Hammurabi or Sargon. Those men were the kings for the whole of Mesopotamia. But throughout the majority of its history, each city-state had its own individual king, called a lugal, who was a proven warrior, elected by the citizenry of the city-state. He was the commander-in-chief, the protector of the people. He was respected and revered, but certainly not worshipped. Below the king in social status were a group of people called aristocrats or nobles. These are wealthy landowners and would include the king and his family, though he occupied a status above the nobles. It also included priests and palace officials. The priests, of course, worked at the ziggurat. The palace officials worked for the king. The next rung of society was occupied by a group of free men and women called the free clients or awilu. These individuals worked the land for the nobles and received plots for their own use for doing a good job of working the plots owned by the nobles. Below them, the majority of society, commoners, free men and women who could not rival those above. These were the working class artisans and craftsmen in ancient Mesopotamia. At the very bottom of this social structure were slaves. This was a minority group in each city-state. Very few people were enslaved in ancient Mesopotamian city-states. Slavery in a Mesopotamian city-state had nothing whatsoever to do with race or ethnicity. The way a person became a slave in Mesopotamia was that he was captured in war with another city-state. He was a prisoner of war and made a slave because he lost. He was on the losing side. Or through debt. In Mesopotamia, and here again it shows the power of males in Mesopotamia, a man who overspent himself, spent more money than he made, could actually sell off his family to his debtors as slaves for a specified period of 3, 4, or 5 years. Meanwhile, the father, the husband who had gotten the family in debt, sells off his family to work off his debt. Meanwhile, he's allowed to marry and have more children. When his first wife and children return from working off the debt, they may find that they now have a secondary status in the home. It was allowed in Mesopotamia for a man to have multiple wives. This ends our discussion of Mesopotamia. Please refer to your textbook and your study guides for more information.